Welcome to the Reef Resilience webinar, Status and Trends of Coral Reefs of the Pacific. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Kristen Mays, and I'm Strategic Communication Manager for the Nature Conservancy's Reef Resilience Network. I'll be your host for today's webinar, which is co-sponsored by the International Coral Reef Initiative, EBM Tools Network, and the Reef Resilience Network. Before we begin, I'd like to just go over a few housekeeping items briefly. Today's webinar will be about 45 minutes. We'll have a 20-minute presentation followed by a question and answer session. There are two ways you can ask questions during the webinar question and answer session. You can use the question box anytime throughout the webinar to send us questions, and we'll keep track of these for the end of the presentation. Or you can raise your hand during the question session of the webinar, and we'll take your question during that time. And you can raise your hand by clicking on that little small hand icon on the toolbar just to the left of your name. If you're having any technical difficulties, such as trouble hearing or seeing the slides during the presentation, you can send us a message via the same question box and we'll try and resolve the issue. Before I introduce our presenter, we would like to ask you a question just to get a sense of who's in the audience, so where you're joining us from. So our poll question for you today is, what is the focus region of your work? I'll give you a few moments to answer that question. Okay, wow, okay, other, interesting. And no surprise, Pacific is in the lead, but it looks like we have a lot of folks from the Caribbean as well. Great, thank you for sharing that. Thanks for participating in the poll. So we are fortunate to hear from Dr. Serge Plan today. So thank you so much, Serge, for presenting. Dr. Plan, or Serge, is Director of Research with the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique and is the Director of the Laboratory of Excellence, LabX Coral. Serge has studied population genetics of marine fish for the past 30 years. He has published more than 200 papers on this subject, as well as on the subjects of ecology, ecology of marine protected areas, and recruitment of marine fishes. Serge's early work suggested that coral reef fish populations are more limited in space than was generally believed prior to the early 1990s. And most of his recent work, using genetic markers and other techniques, has confirmed his view that marine populations conform to a stepping stone model with limited gene flow occurring between adjacent populations. Well, now pass it over to Serge to begin the presentation. Give you a few moments to load your slides, Serge.
I think that should be working right now.
Yep, looks great.
Great. So I'm starting whenever it's okay. If you want, I can start right now.
Perfect. Now's perfect.
Welcome everyone. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to present some of the work we did in the context of the GSRMN, that is the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network. That is a network that belongs to the ICRI, the International Coral Reef Initiative. So that work was a continuity in some ways of some of the work that have been done already in the Caribbean a few years ago to try to synthesize the evolution of the coral reef through times by gathering most of the analyses that were done before. So there has been already a couple of those reports that have been out already for the Pacific in 2011 and far before, since the beginning of the GSRMN, the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network. And what is important is that those statues are important because they evaluate, they measure in some ways, and then quantify the change on the coral reef, because it is a need to be able to show what is the change and to be able to demonstrate to the public, to the politicians, to any decider, any people who can sort of decide on the management perspective, what is exactly the status and the evolution of the reef, and what has been the change. Because often we're losing track of memory because we have the focus of what we have seen as individual like 15 years ago, but what we have seen 15 years ago doesn't really shows what was there something like 30 years ago or 40 years ago. So it is important to try to track back those change through time. The work that I'm going to present now, very briefly and very synthesized, is a work that has been done in the Pacific, and I shall first acknowledge all the contributors. It was a work that has in total more than 30 different quarters, and all the contributors are the one who provide data to get to the establishment and the vision of the evolution of the coral reef in the Pacific. The Pacific is one of the wider, actually, area in terms of spreading. It is about it accumulates about 25% of the coral reef of the planet, but it's mainly made of islands, and it's mainly made of small islands spread over the Pacific. We've got 23 different countries, which of course means 23 different way of managing coral reef and managing environment in general, and about 25,000 islands. When we come to that, the problem is that the present work is clearly a collaborative regional effort. More than 200 people were contacted across the whole the Pacific countries and nation. You have on that map all the different islands for which we have data. In total, that's about only 130 islands, which you would say, compared to the 25,000 islands in the Pacific, that's a very minor in sense of in terms of number of islands. But you have to imagine that, first of all, numbers of those islands are uninhabited, so there's basically nobody going there, and so there's no information at all. And then secondly is that those all 25,000 islands are very widespread across an area where it's often very difficult to get a significant data. But in total, we were able to gather about to collect about 20,000 survey, both bentos and fish, on about 50 time series, and then of course spread over the Pacific, as you can see. But there is clearly, as you can see, some gap. Like there is clearly gap in the Solomon Islands. There's clearly gap in the Papua New Guinea Islands. There's clearly gap in some of those areas that we'll have in the future to think about how to make sure that we can, at least if nothing's been done on those places, we can start things and start sort of monitoring on those places. What are the main results? And I'm not going to spend much time into going into how we organize and how we collected those data. The first result that came out is and you have here at the bottom the percentage of coral cover. Percentage of coral is widely sort of recognized as one of the key sort of indicator of the evolution of the reef, even if you will see that this is not sufficient most of the times. But what we see for the Pacific, it's actually fairly stable. Since 1990, basically, the coral reef were representing about, the live coral cover in the coral reef were representing about 25%, and since 1995, I would say, from which we have really good data for the last 30 years, we can say that clearly there's a fairly stability in terms of live coral cover. There's only a slight little decrease on the last 3 or 4 years, and I shall mention that these data are not including 2016 or 2017 that were also marked by with strong El Nino events on those periods. So it'll be interesting to have those new. You have on top the number of islands that were sampled, and you can see that until 2005 there was a limited number of islands. Since 2005 there's a significant amount of islands, and in some ways the trend is not clearly affected by the number of islands that you have been sampled through time. What is interesting as well is to realize that all the dots that you've seen that are gray dots are showing individual islands system, and you can see that there's a high variability, and a very high variability. So some islands are in close to, some places are close to 0% of coral cover, some places are close to 50-60% of live coral cover. Now coming back to looking at in more detail some of the main taxa, and here we have 3 taxa which are really the main ones sort of making the coral reef, and those 3 taxa are the Acropora, the Porcellopora, and the Porites. So 2 of those taxa are branching corals. One is a massive coral, and you can see that basically the branching coral, Porcellopora, Acropora, are decreasing, while the Porites are clearly increasing. And what is and this is, while we have a stability in the coral reef, we can see that there is a big change in the quality of the coral that are there, in the diversity of the coral that are making those the live coral cover. You can see here, and then so what we can see is that despite we have a stability in terms of coral cover, live coral cover, we have a strong change in terms of the dominance in the community of those coral. And we are shifting in less than 20 years, in a very small time, we are shifting from coral reef dominated by branching coral to coral reef that are dominated by massive coral. And this is a loss of diversity. This is a loss of habitat diversity. This is a loss that will then lead to probably some loss in associated fauna, which can be mollusks and various invertebrates up to fish. Because of course the inhabitants of a very diverse coral reef, including branching and massive coral, will be different than in a coral reef that is mainly dominated by massive corals such as Porites, for example. And that's the type of coral you can see when you have a coral, a sort of a coral reef dominated by Porites. The live coral cover in a reef like that is very high, but the diversity of coral is very low, and of course the diversity of associated fauna becoming very low. But so in sort of the take-home message that I would like to emphasize is that in some ways we have no clear global decline of coral in the Pacific, and I'm clear about that in the Pacific, but there is clearly some change in different taxa, with some taxa that are declining, some that are replacing, and we have clearly a loss of habitat and a loss of diversity in the coral reef that we are monitoring through times. What is important is now what will be the look of the future coral reef, what they will look like, what will be the consequence in terms of ecosystem services. These are the 2 key questions that are in the future. But I would like to now put this main outcome of the result of this work into a sort of a context, in the general context. The general context regarding coral reef is first of all, there is a very, like I was saying, there is a very high local variability, and clearly you can see on the gray spot here on the diagram that clearly there are reefs that are very close to almost no live coral. There are reefs that are very close to 50-60% of live coral, which is clearly a climax, something that you can expect as a maximum. And this is not surprising, because if we are looking, for example, on change on one places, I took the area of Morea because this is one of the longest trend we have in the Pacific. You can see that over a period of 40 years, so starting in early 1980s, we have been through 3 main decrease and change of the live coral cover. You can see that from 1990 to 1995, there's been a strong decrease. Then there's been an increase again over the 6 years after. Then there's been a decrease again in around 1993. Then there's been an increase again. Then there's been a recent decrease. Those decreases are well described. There are both implicating acanthaster, which is the chronosome starfish explosion, or they can be related to bleaching, or they can be related to major cyclones that are destroying the reef on place. So clearly you can have reef that are in very good shape through times, and And so that dynamics in the Pacific clearly is something that is driving also the change in some ways, but it's also what is driving actually some kind of stability through time, because some reef are decreasing, some reef are increasing, and if you overlap all the reef, then you get to this average of 20–25% of coral reef, which would be an average if you were averaging the last 40 years in Murray Islands. The other aspect is that I'd like to connect to the idea of putting in perspective what we have found in the Pacific that you have here in the central area compared to some other studies that are here. What you can see is that clearly in the Pacific we are showing there is a stability, despite the fact that I've said that there's a clear change in the diversity, but we're finding similar or different patterns. For example, if we're looking at in the Caribbean, we have in the Caribbean, if you separating the 3 areas within the Caribbean, which is a report that has been done earlier on, you have clearly 2 areas that are the area A and B that are decreasing. We have an area that is the area C, where actually there's a kind of stability over the last 40 years. If you're looking at what's happening in the southwest, Indian Ocean, same thing. You got clearly a kind of stability. But here, with the data that we have, you can see as well that we have a high variability between the different trajectories. So this sort of average sort of line is really an average between very different trajectory, with reef going through down and up according to local parameters. And then the last aspect is on the GBR, where in the GBR there's actually clearly a decrease of coral reef, with an average that came from something about 30% in 1985 to go to close to 15% in the area by the 2010–2012. So here in the GBR, clearly there's been a reduction of coral reef. So the different areas are showing clearly different patterns. And what I would like to emphasize in the end of that talk is that not everything is stable, everything is unstable, but these things that are unstable doesn't necessarily drive all the coral reef to sort of a loss and a definitive loss. There are places that are clearly resilient. There are places that are showing some potential for recovery. It is clear that this recovery is going to showing that the future of coral reef will be very different than the present day coral reef. We will have more of the resilient species, so probably more of the massive species. We will have less of the more fragile branching species, and so that will probably turn into a different ecosystem. That different ecosystem will be still a coral reef ecosystem, but that different ecosystem will probably host different species. And the assemblage of the different species that we'll have, the fish, the mollusk, the various invertebrates that will be there, will be different. And that will be, to me, one of the major change in the coral reef. So yes, there will be a clear change of most of the coral reef from the world. It doesn't mean that there will be a complete disappearance of coral reef from the world. I want to end up to that. And then, of course, I'll be very happy to answer any question and discuss about those results.
Great. Thank you, Serge. That was very interesting and hopeful for once, which was nice. I'd now like to open it up for questions. Remember that you can either send us your question via the question box or raise your hand icon, and we'll go ahead and unmute you and call on you to ask your question yourself. A couple questions have come in, so I'll start with those. This is a 2-part question. I'll start with the first part. Is the loss of diversity or change in functional groups and taxa seen across all the Pacific, or more specific to certain large or key areas?
It's difficult to say that is specific to some areas. I would say that because we're working on average values, it's an average value across the Pacific. Clearly, there are places where changes are less significant than others, but because the change in coral reef are mainly due to two parameters that are the local stressor and the global stressor. Global stressor being related to climate change, on which present day local management doesn't mean much things, then local stressors are really all what is related to pollution, to sewage, to agricultural developments, and all those sort of aspects, and those are also very impacting coral reef. So according to how much, especially the local impact are playing, well, the change may be more significant in those places where there's actually more activity, more sort of dense population, human population nearby the coastline. But I think overall, I think we can say this is a global pattern on the Pacific.
Excellent. Thanks, Serge. And the second part of that question was, any sense of why Porites is increasing? Do you see a correlation with it being more resilient to warmer waters, bleaching events, storms?
Definitively, Porites is and some other of those massive species are considered as more resilient. And when there's a aquarium experiment, clearly there are more resilience to bleaching, there are more resilience to sedimentation. They're clearly stronger coral, basically stronger coral species. You know, it's like in any sort of large taxa, you have species that are more fragile, less resistant than others. I think Porites is clearly a more resistant species. And in a situation of stress, like we have now, with a global stress due to climate change, and then regular temperature heats, and local stress, where those species are just more resistant.
Mm-hmm. Okay, next question. What effects would these changes of habitat type have on fish biomass?
Well, on fish biomass, on fish biomass, it's very difficult to answer to that question, because if you were asking me on fish diversity, it would be very straightforward. As soon as you're changing the habitat and you're reducing the diversity of the habitat, you will reduce, in the meantime, at the same time, you will reduce the diversity of the habitants of these habitats. So the inhabitants of this habitat, and the fish being part of that, you will reduce. The biomass is a little bit different, because the biomass is basically, if you are changing if you are changing in some ways the coral diversity, it doesn't mean really that you will change the biomass of fish. I come back, for example, from a place that is called Clipperton. The number of corals there it's very reduced, something like 10, 12 species, but the biomass in fish is very high. So the biomass in fish is not necessarily directly linked to the diversity of coral reef. But clearly, if we're changing, if at some stage we started changing the ratio between coral reef and algae, and we're changing the coral reef, then we may play on the biomass. But the diversity of the coral reef will not necessarily affect the biomass, and I'm talking about biomass here, and I'm very precise, but it will change clearly the biodiversity, so the diversity, number of species, basically.
Excellent. Thanks, Serge. Do you consider that it is important to work on restoration of coral species that, according to the trend, are not adapting to the ocean changes? Ooh, that's a...
Well, yes. First of all, I will answer clearly, yes. Yes, we don't want to lose species. We don't want to lose diversity. I think we as a human society owns in some ways our planet. Our planet has been sort of able to diversify in so many forms, and I think we don't have the right to decide which species will be left after us and which species will be gone after us. So I think we have to do in some ways that we're trying to protect them, and then we cannot leave everything going by themselves and going down because we're not good in managing and we're not good into protecting. I don't think philosophically, I don't think we can go into that sort of direction. So how to protect that? Well, there's a lot of ideas those days to how to protect. clearly there is some ways that is called assisted evolution, which is to try to find in those fragile species some genotype, some I would say individual in some ways that are more resistant than others, and then to try to develop those ones, to promote those individuals, to favor those individuals because they will be more resilient than others. There are also perspective into trying to find sort of in the sort of assisted evolution, in trying to find in some ways to how to hybridize some species, and then to see if some hybrids by what we call the increasing the strongness of the hybrids, if there is possibility at least to maintain through those hybrids actually the genes that comes from both species, and so to maintain in some ways the anteriority. But yes, I think we have to try to find some ways to work into maintaining the diversity of the coral. There's about 1,200, about between 1,200 and 1,400 species of coral, and I think we have to try to work into maintaining them. They will not disappear because in high latitude and things like that, some will persist for sure. Most will persist, but they will become more rare, and then that's where the impact into the ecosystem might be important, and that's where the impact into the diversity of all the associated fauna might be very important.
Thank you, Serge. And while we're on this topic, can you share recommendations for managers from the report? So a few other, since we're on the topic of interventions and things managers can do.
Yeah. I have been in the last few years strong in advocating that there are things we can do immediately. There are things that will see some outcome in a long period of time, and then in many cases we cannot wait for a long period of time. All what is related to climate change will take a long time before we see an impact. Yes, of course, it doesn't mean we cannot work into trying to develop any solution for reducing our carbon emissions, and then of course we have to work on that. But that, even if we work today, and even if we work strongly on that, we'll see the impact in 20, 30, probably more, 50 to 100 year from now. So coral reef in some areas cannot wait that long. They need to be protected right now. Clearly one of the strongest effects that we can see on coral reef, it's actually local effect. It's sewage management, it's river sedimentation, and then by development of agriculture and uncontrolled release through the river. It's all what is related to pollution. It's all what is related to coastal management. And what I will include all into what is coastal management, which is coastal development, which is also, of course, all what is related to the increasing density of population along the coast, human population along the coast. That we can actually manage that more rapidly. We can decide it more rapidly that we will not allow the development on the river plume if there is not a way to control for sedimentation. We can decide that we will work into promoting the sewage, and then not promoting the sewage, sorry, promoting the depollution, promoting the control of the sewage, limiting basically any kind of sewage that goes into the coral reef that is on the shore. We can work into developing more biological control of pesticide and everything, rather than releasing chemicals that are clearly having impact into coral reef. So those are all what is related to coastal management. These are all what is related to taking decision that can have an impact very quickly on the coral reef. It's not going to be something that will have an impact in 50 years. It's something that will have an impact in the next 3 years, in the next 5 years. And I think And of course, those impacts are local. Is that if you are doing something on your coral reef right now, then you'll have an impact on your coral reef just a couple of years from now. And that's, I think that is, to me, where we should focus our effort right now, is to try to work into local management and trying to organize basically how the reef can be locally protected. And then in the meantime, of course, working through the international sort of community into trying to I would say limit the change in terms of climate change.
Excellent. Thanks, Serge. I'm doing a lot of head nodding over here. I'm sure others are as well. A number of questions have come in related to algae. Serge, can you talk briefly about what this study looked at in terms of macroalgae, and maybe just share the high-level findings, since there have been so many questions?
The high-level finding is that clearly we're showing a sort of the algae sort of there's a clear increase of algae, but it's very cycling in a sense. What we're showing is that it's up and down over the last 20-25 years in the Pacific, where we have clearly increase and decrease of algae, like if that was related to sort of global El Nino sort of impact at the global scale, but it's doesn't seems to be correlate or link it to coral reef itself. So it's while we have a stable sort of live coral cover, we can see some cycle in the algae. So the algae system seems to be sort of more maybe climate driven, or high sort of large cycle climate driven, such as El Nino or impact like that, at the scale of the Pacific, of course. We see overall an increase in algae, but it's not something dramatic, and we could not relate that to fish biomass, herbivore biomass, or change in herbivore biomass. So it is to me, it's a complex trend. And then the problem is that because we are accumulating very different islands, very different case situation and everything, the algae sort of outcome is not very easy, or is not easy to understand and to interpret for us. But what we're showing is there's a clear increase. It's not a huge increase. It's that, from my souvenir, I think we're going from 5 to something like 12% of substrate cover of algae. So it's not a huge increase, but there's a significant, it's significant, and there's a significant increase in the algae.
Great. And for everyone that asked a question related to algae, please let me know if you have a follow-up. I have a number of other questions here. Oh, I saw a few hands go up, and now I'm not seeing them. So if you would like to ask a question yourself, please put your hand back up. In the meantime, I'll go back to our lists here. Okay, so next question. It's tricky to account for reef monitoring locations that have been abandoned over the years because they've been wiped out or degraded to the point that no reasonable sampling intensity could detect a meaningful change. Does the information you present account for this? So looking at it, then it continues, the statistical influence of many locations at 0% cover.
Yeah. In our yes, that's clear to me. Yes, the way the analysis were done was clearly done into sort of first of all, there are places that have been clearly more studied than others, and so because we didn't want to bias the system by places where you have basically four monitoring versus places where you have only one, or places where you have 0, we basically locally sort of made some average for each island, for each archipelago, for each area, to see how much the local sort of information might bias actually the change at the global scale, which we find, and we could find that actually we were not biasing the trends that we have, and the trend that we have is not biased by one location or a group of location rather than another one. And so in some ways that sort of answer the question is that because of maintaining all the different locations that are monitored, and you can see that actually there's been an increase in locations that are monitored through times, because you could see that the number of sites and the number of time series was just increasing and not decreasing or being swapped to something. So in average, we believe, and I believe, that the trends that we're having, because of all the resampling that we've done and all the analysis of resampling that we've done, are providing in the end the same trend. So I don't think that is affected by a sort of sampling strategy that would in some ways avoid some location, because they're sort of, yes, they're not showing any recovery or any coral reef anymore.
Great. And I am going to try and call Romeo. If you would like to speak, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Your hand has come on and off a number of times, so please share your question at this time if you would like to. Radio silence. Romeo, if you have a question and would like to share it with Serge, please do so. Okay, moving on to another hand. We'll try. Michelle, I'm going to give your mute button a try. Michelle, if you're there and have a question, please share it.
Yes, I am here. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Awesome. So you had said that we should start supporting some of the species of branching corals that are more hardy. Which species do you think should be targeted for that, for either just support or propagation?
So sorry, I didn't catch the beginning of the question.
You had said that we should start targeting support for some of the hardier branching corals. Which species do you think should be targeted for the support or even propagation purposes?
Well, right now, I think this is really under the those aspects that is linked to I would say the assisted evolution is actually really under fundamental science right now, fundamental research, and it's a little bit too early already to go into that. But clearly, people are doing like what we call common garden, which is taking the same clone, the same piece of colonies, spreading them in different area, and then looking at which one actually are more capable in each of the area, and if there are some that are actually doing better and in any area. And so those ones will be the one that you will have to favor in some ways if you want to propagate those ones. It's difficult to give a name of a species or a certain species itself, because it's very variable from a region to another one. It's highly different from one region to another one. But clearly, it's to try to maintain actually in many places the diversity of the different taxa and especially the diversity of the coral taxa as much as we can, and not leaving the corals basically going into just massive and Porides dominated coral reef.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Michelle.
That doesn't really answer in detail in some ways, and I cannot give you like I would say the magic formula saying, well, you have to protect for this one or for this one. I think it's often, and it's the same thing as when I'm talking about local management. It's actually often very specific to a local area according to the species diversity that is there, and according to the capability each of those species are in being resilient to and from one individual to another one.
Great. Thanks, Serge. Let's try one more hand. Jian, if you are there and would like to share your question yourself, please do so. Jian, can you hear us? It looks like your connectivity is a little iffy. Okay, I've remuted you. Let us know if you'd like to ask your question yourself. I'm going to go back to the questions submitted. Okay, so here's one. When we did the Western Indian Ocean report and analysis, there were large variations in trends, sometimes as an artifact of the data. So for example, due to inconsistencies with monitoring at sites rather than real changes on the ground. So this is another similar question, but did you face the same issues with your data, which may have confounded some of the results?
Yeah, in some ways, because we are not using our sort of a standardized protocol, and because if you want to go into such a large sort of analysis, you have to agglomerate and you have to integrate a sort of different monitoring approach or different monitoring sort of, I would say, methods. Well, of course, you get to this point where you're wondering and you're questioning yourself about how stable is the monitoring, how consistent is the monitoring, and how these consistency may affect, or inconsistency may affect the pattern. Here we've been through all the different sort of monitoring and sort of time series, basically monitoring time series. We've been very clear. Numerous of them have been eliminated to try to keep basically all the ones that were consistent. Of course, we were not behind each time series, each person counting fish or coral, and so of course there can be limitation. The interest is to see, to me, is to realize that these high variability, it's also something that you find in the trend of each time series. And clearly, when you go in detail in some of the time series, which one that I show in the presentation, you realize that those trends and those high variability through times, it's actually not just a problem of counting. It's not a methodological problem. It is clearly linked to some impact the reef had to sustain, such as cyclones, such as bleaching, such as acanthaster, and then some else can be mentioned sometimes. And so I think this high variability is actually more due to once again to some of those impacts that are more local than others.
Thank you, Serge. And it looks like we have time for one more question. Jian wrote the question in, so I will ask it for you. The economy of many of these countries in the area depend directly from resources provided by the reefs. Are the governments aware of this data you're sharing, and how are they reacting to it?
Okay, this report was one of the partner in this report was actually for the Pacific was the SPREP. So the basically the SPREP is the South Pacific program for environment, and so environmental regional environmental program. So clearly that's that's an organization that is in charge of helping the countries in the Pacific to develop an environmental sort of programs, and develop environmental programs under I'd say under proposal that comes from a larger community. And so the goal and one of the work of the SPREP has been to promote and to propagate the result of this report, to emphasize the fact that local management will have a direct impact on the coral reef, and will be very important to and it will be very important to devote sort of project and programs onto protecting locally and to developing local protection onto the coral reef. So that's clearly one of the goals. There's been the SPREP organized already a couple of meetings, especially to present those results, especially to emphasize the importance of developing local management issues and developing local management program. I think overall that's one of the goals, is to always sort of associated organization, international organizations such as the SPREP in the Pacific, to sort of scientists work on sort of coming out with some output that can be then communicated to local manager, to government stakeholder, and then so they can take that take-home message and then try to see what can be done basically in each of those countries, because it's in the end it becomes the job of each country or each community basically to decide how much emphasis, how much effort they want to put into their local management.
Great. Thank you, Serge. And I'm sorry to have to wrap up the question and answer session, but we've come to the end of our time. We encourage you to continue the conversation. For those of you who didn't get to ask your questions, you can share them on the Reef Resilience Network discussion forum, which is an interactive online community, managers, practitioners, and experts from around the world. So you can go to reefresilience.org and click on the network tab, or just go straight to that link displayed on the screen. You can log in or join the forum and start or join a discussion there. And Serge, we invite you to join the forum as well. We'll be sending out instructions for how to log in when we email out the link of the webinar recording. So this is recorded. You'll be able to listen to the presentation again. We'll also be sending out the link to the full report that Serge shared highlights from today. If you're not on our e-news and webinar announcement list and would like to be, please email us at resilience@tnc.org, and we'll make sure you get all of those e-notifications. And just another note, all of our webinars really emerge from topics that managers, experts, or partners want to share about. So if you have any suggestions for future webinar topics, please share to the same email, so resilience@tnc.org. And thank you everyone for joining us today, and special thanks to our presenter, Serge. So thank you so much for sharing. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Okay, bye.